Hello and welcome to another episode of Mordred's Community Multiplayer Political Chat. As always, I'm joined by Brother Zale, and this week we've got another special guest in our fearless Frenchman, Fier. Welcome to the program, Fier.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
And Zale, how's it
Yeah,
going?
always fun. It's going pretty good, man. How you doing?
As always, I'm doing great. So, uh, we'll take a quick look, Great Powers, before we start. Fier, initial reaction. This is quite different than it was a week ago. We've got Great Britain 1, Spain 2, Ottomans have tumbled to 3, Russia, as always, hanging in there, and then Portugal, Qing, VJ, and Malaya. Any surprises here for you, Fier?
Not particularly, considering who's running Spain, Britain, and the Ottomans. I fully expected them to remain in relative dominant control, be it through the actual deliberate conquest of foreign lands or simply through the careful application of development. And I know the colonial powers get a substantial boost there from their colonies, and in particular having players in them, deving them up, and also getting some of the bonus score from those colonies, and also they themselves contributing development point or monarch points to their development as well to make them stronger and more capable. So, all in all, not at all surprised that they are getting such buffs. It makes sense that they are on top. Portugal being in fifth is to be expected as well. Again, it gets huge buffs from its colonies, but it itself is not exactly the biggest landmass in the game. But it's definitely grown quite a bit. Russia being fourth, I foresee is probably going to change in the future, but for now that makes sense. Qing has grown a lot, so that's definitely a big surprise and good to see. Seeing them in sixth. Vijayanagar is one of those other ones that I think you kind of tend to expect. As that VJ tends to be one of the ones that dominates India. As it gets going, it just kind of, eats everyone else. Malaya being in eighth is perhaps the bigger surprise. What I would probably have expected by this point would be, for example, Prussia to usurp them on that list. My only guess is that perhaps to a certain degree Prussia is quite intentionally keeping himself below the development limit so that he can have a few more options as a potential ally to people, rather than being limited to counting as two players. He still only counts as one, whilst having a substantial army and a lot of strength. So I wonder if there's been any intentional holding back there, but maybe not though. But yeah, I don't foresee Malaya staying on there for long, so I'm a little surprised they're still there, but I doubt it's going to be for much longer, to be honest.
And Zale, real quick, any surprises or things jump out to you on this Great Power list?
Um, the biggest surprise for me is probably the fact that Malaya is still on the Great Power list. Similar to what Fear was saying, I would have expected Prussia or perhaps Netherlands or Rajputana to kind of usurp them, given how the sharks seem to be coming around Malaya's town. And then the other thing is Qing. I'm surprised is as high as they are on the GP. They're about where I expect, but I was expecting more of a 7 or an 8. But he's done, I don't know, he's done a pretty decent job of getting some high dev. So it kind of makes me happy to see, because we were trying to work out a deal that would still get us both a good amount, and it seems to be that we've sort of done that. So
Nepal, tributary state of Qing. Any particular reason?
yeah, the only reason we did that was right at the end of the session, so his mandate could get growth. I fully expect it to get hammered this upcoming session, so getting as much as we can in there. It's not like I'm going to be declaring war on anyone that he'll I'll need to call him in for.
Makes sense.
I don't expect to declare any war.
So we'll start today, dive into it. We had Ottomans versus Rajputana. Rajputana was joined by their faithful allies in Nepal and Vijayanagar. A few assorted condottieri were involved. Qing, Switzerland, Westphalia, and the incredibly efficient Ethiopian condottieri. But for the most part, it was Ottomans versus India. Um, Bloody war. I think total casualties in battle 3 million. an additional 2 million in attrition, so just over 5 million total men. Only 2 provinces changed hands, a center of trade in the Lahore node, but in reality, basically a draw. Um, I knew it was happening. You knew it was happening. It happened real quick into the session. Did it catch you off guard at all, or did you know it was coming right away?
Um, I didn't really catch me off guard. I expected that when we talked prior to session. I think it was just the day before session. I had kind of gotten some feelings that you're going to be doing it, especially with a player supposedly was coming into Hormuz. Um, so I expected that, and with how Jamie was talking as well, when I was chatting with him, he didn't seem to be as keen on invading the Ottomans as I expected. So um, yeah, I think it was pretty much from the get-go, and that's probably one of the 2 or 3 driving reasons why we see the diplomacy with Russia kind of shake out, and a real sort of Asian hug boxes kind of formed now, where before it was a little shaky, but now because the seeing all these different people coming in from the outside, I think it's kind of forced us to band together.
And just so people know, the war took a little over 20 years. Rajputana started close to 0 manpower after the long Russia war from the previous session. Vijay was relatively untouched. Nepal still had a little bit of manpower. I, as the Ottomans, had full manpower, and over the course of the war, just continually threw my troops at a single mountain fort here, or hill fort, thinking I could get through and then break into the rest of Rajputana. I was able to win a few mountain sieges, Kabul, whatever, Quetta, and then I believe there's one up here, that I was able to grab. But in reality, this was just an outer wall. The war really stalemated, and then eventually I was able to break through Kalat. And once this fort fell, there's no defensive terrain here for Rajput to stand behind, and I was able to win battles on even terrain. So we made a peace deal. I was pretty drained, worried about exposure from the east, or from the west, Europe coming in with my manpower hovering near 0. Fuhrer, from your perspective, as that war was going on, were you surprised that no one from Europe jumped in and took advantage of the situation?
Not too surprised. I think your pregame diplomacy had secured you a fairly quiet front in that regard, and also your throughout the game diplo as well for the session. The only one I will say I might have expected to actually jump on you would have been the Russians themselves. You did give them a lot of money after that last session, like about 20,000 ducats total, which was huge. But you were also a substantial part of why they were drained and on the verge of collapse in the first place. So I could have seen them being like, "Nah, man, I'm just gonna roll right in and try and capitalize on this while I can." The fact that they didn't surprise me, but at the same time, Russia having a quiet session is only a good thing for Russia too. So yeah, that's the only perhaps one I would have expected to try to come after you.
And we'll touch on Russia's session in a minute here. It was pretty impressive, but just wrapping up with the war, personally, I had a great time. I learned quite a bit. It was my first large-scale war that I fought independent. In previous multiplayers, I've fought alongside Bavaria, Prussia, Byzantium to try to take down Jamie. I've fought in some other wars, but this was the first one where I was coming up with the strategy, and definitely a learning experience for myself. Zale, from your perspective, how do you think the Indians felt about the war? Were they able to find some enjoyment, or was it frustrating?
Yeah, I think for all of us, we found a lot of enjoyment out of it. It was kind of a I can't speak for the others, but I think it was a good chance and a good job of kind of bringing our diplo together and communication, kind of working out the kinks and stuff. And it also showed that because there was a time when you declared on the Mamluks, and Vijayanagar declared on Bengal, and that was when you declared on the Mamluks. That was what allowed us to sort of push you back away from the mountain forts you had sieged. And then when Vijayanagar declared on Bengal, it's what allowed you to kind of come back, and that's when you figured out, oh wait, maybe I should go south where there's less mountains. And I think ultimately those two things is what resulted in the peace we have now, the deal that came out of it. And so I think it was a really good learning opportunity for everyone
Yeah,
involved.
and just so outsiders are aware, during the war, I declared on Mamelukes, underestimated them and their vassal swarm, had my hands full splitting focus between it, and lost all progress against Rajput. And I believe I was in the -40 on war score. I was getting pretty close to getting stabbed out. Um, Ethiopia had a 5 siege general as condottieri that was just surfacing left and right, sieging forts in a heartbeat. So that took a big chunk out of the war score, but never fell below that 50 point, which was, I think, saved me in the end there. And
Yeah, I agree. There was a few times where I remember you asked for white peace with the Raj player, and I was counseling not to, which maybe in hindsight maybe we should have, but you could have also not have dropped so far as well. So it's kind of interesting how that played out. I don't know. What do you think that we should have white peaced a little sooner, or do you think that it was smart for us to kind of draw the war out?
I don't know. From my perspective, what I recall was that war kind of seesawing a little bit, not just in terms of winner versus loser, because that was fairly static start, but more in terms of geographic landscape. Yeah, there's that one fort that obviously has like a million casualties at it. But beyond that, I believe, if I remember correctly, there was a point where basically, Torfin, you withdrew back into Persia, so you could actually start fighting them more on uneven terrain to basically to your advantage, and they started pursuing you, and you started beating them there in order to basically retake some of your progress, as well as recovering some of your manpower as well. I might be misremembering that. I think that was one of the things that was said at the time. Could be mistaken. That was my understanding. So
yeah, once I withdrew, I fell back and took a few fights on the dry lands or the desert, and did a lot better than I was doing in the highlands and the mountains. That's for sure.
Yeah,
it's almost like this place. I think we call it Afghanistan. It's almost like it has this reputation of something about empires and graveyards. I think it was. What do you think there, Zale? Did you think something about that, or?
Yeah, I think if you look at the casualties, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's some stories or something about just massive empires going there and collapsing on themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
yeah. I think so.
Ro was the key province in the initial phase of the war, and you can see winner in fight after fight was Vijayanagar and Rajputana in Ro, and the casualties were pretty intense. 500,000, 500,000, quarter million.
I believe the total outcome was like 1.6 million dead.
Yeah, it was
something nuts like that.
Bloody. So we'll pivot now. Spent a little bit of time on that, but while this was all going on, there was a little bit of drama in the New World Fuhrer. Alaska ran into a colonial powerhouse with Great Britain declaring on it, and I believe Great Britain was able to take a decent chunk of Alaska's land. Is that accurate?
Believe so. Yeah, he took a few provinces there. Oh, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, for colonial land taken, not too much. But for any other nation in the game, like if that was in Europe, those number of provinces taken would be huge. That's like eight or nine provinces. Most other countries in Europe, that would be a very big deal. That's a lot of land to lose. It tends to happen a lot more easily in the New World that land changes hands, largely because it's cheaper and less developed. So that war did happen. It was there was definitely some people a little unhappy with the British about that, not just the Alaskans. But I find it hard to believe that Alaska shouldn't have seen something like this coming. They were never going to have a free hand in the New World. They were never going to be allowed to just grow and colonize there without being, contested. And since they moved their home there, that just makes them a bit vulnerable. Meanwhile, these colonial nations who have an overlord to look after them don't have the same limitations and risks that Alaska does. So these are things that I think any player trying to do a migratory game in particular needs to consider. And I mean, the sad reality is I'm not sure Alaska had a lot to bring to the table to incentivize allies to really support them, other than just being a generally nice guy kind of thing.
And we'll pivot into one of the other wars now that took place as well. Um, you'll have to cover this for the most part, Zale, but I believe it was Qing versus Japan, Malaya, and maybe Ethiopia.
Yeah, I'm not so sure Ethiopia. Maybe he did call the arms, answer the call to arms, but I'm not sure. Um, but essentially, as we were kind of looking at earlier, Qing has a lot of cores um, in China and stuff, and of course, he and I have a deal. That's why he's been revoking those cores. But we were trying to come to a deal with Malaya, and Giles was wanting money and trade, and we were saying we could theoretically do trade, but we can't really do money. We have a Ottoman to fight. We have a Russia at the time because this was before session. We have a Russia we might have to fight again. So we can't really afford. Up till now, he's been the one. Malaya's been helping me with finances, and essentially, kind of Diplo stagnated. And then during the session, Curb, who is the Qing player, he comes to me and he's like, "Hey, so apparently Malaya has been fabricating claims all up and down my coastline." And so what he ended up doing was he just declared a preemptive war for unified China, and he took most everything. He forgot about Macau, but yeah, it's okay. Hopefully there's a deal there, or maybe there's going to be another war. But yeah, it was kind of interesting. I think that Giles was hoping, and Faceless were hoping that Vijayanagар, who Malaya was allied to previously, I think they were hoping he'd play a more active role in the war. But as it was, they stood no chance against Qing. Like, I didn't even have to get called in to that war. I think I was still fighting you at the time. So, because they've gone so naval, Malaya and Japan can't really effectively fight a war against Qing. Japan has some decent ideas that would allow them to do okay on land, but that's not enough, and especially not with the amount of money and the force limit that Qing has right now and the manpower. And so it's going to be interesting to see, especially from a European standpoint or a colonial standpoint, because if they continue to have hostilities, that opens the way for especially Great Britain, but also potentially the Portuguese to expand more into the Spice Islands or even into China itself.
Yeah, and on that note, could you actually click on one of the Qing armies? Something else that Zale didn't touch on that's important as well. So those armies are purple, and those armies are purple because they are banners. And if you hover over them, you'll see what that means. So they get all sorts of different buffs just on their flat stuff, and they use less manpower than a normal regiment. So like this is what these Asian powers who went primarily naval focused thought they could fight and beat. I want to caution them. These are the kinds of things you need to consider. The banners of Qing, or anyone who controls China, are no joke. If you don't have a qualitative advantage on land, they will wreck your face.
Especially in the current age, because they have the age bonus that gives them plus 50%, I believe.
Yes, they do. And that is big. That's a substantial amount.
Yeah.
So that's...
And also, especially, they have Russia as an ally. So
yes, So these are all things players need to consider before they go and attack China. And try to fight a land war. The old adage, never fight a land war in Asia. This is a prime example. Now, granted, that's usually because of scope of terrain, but in this case, it's also troop quality. The Qing armies are better. They have banners. You have to be aware of that when you go in. If you're not, it's going to hurt you.
So
Yeah.
let's pivot now and touch on Russia. Zale, you mentioned before the outside threat of Russia and the Ottomans was solidifying an Asian hug box, but looks like Russia is allied with Qing after they fought against each other in the previous session. Russia, as mentioned, had a very quiet session, was able to capitalize on it after effectively the war last session was so brutal to the Russian economy, they essentially stagnated and did not progress between previous weeks. Their economy is humming. Their manpower is extreme, and their force limit potential is the highest in the game right now. Is this Russian-Qing alliance for real, or is it temporary just to make use of the no truce break mechanic?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is that it is a permanent thing. If you recall, the whole war started because I had some serious miscommunication. In other words, it was my fault, and the whole war. And so at the beginning of this session, we talked it out during the week. And at the beginning of the session, it was kind of a gut check, right? Because Russia was still at a point where we could have declared war on them again, and pretty much ended their campaign if it had gone well, and if you had delayed your attack, or we just not bothered to fight you and let Raj get a chunk bitten out of them. So I think given that was our mistake and that we kind of decided to trust Russia has proven to be pretty trustworthy. Qing and him are still working out deals and stuff. He's allied to Qing but not me, so he could have declared war. There's a period where he could have declared war, and it would have been kind of interesting to see how that would have gone, and he didn't. He decided not to, and especially with you now being allied with the Prussians, who the Prussians have no love lost with the Swedes, and you have no love lost, I'd assume, with Russia, and he with you.
I love Calico.
I didn't say Calico, I said Russia. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of turns out in this upcoming session, and especially we didn't mention it, but I'd like to briefly punch on the topic of Qing has the mandate, so the old adage of you don't fight a land war in Asia. They might people might be tempted to try to do the naval blockade and raise the devastation to cause them to do a Qing explosion or something, but while that's happening, you're going to have Russia or Russia's allies, assuming things work out, fighting a land war against your allies in Europe, potentially, or while their ships, perhaps it's Malaya, perhaps it's Great Britain, even Portugal, they're doing this blockade that leaves their homelands open to being invaded by Russia or Russia's allies or another player. You never know. But it's going to be interesting to see kind of how that shakes out. I think the Russia-Qing alliance is here to stay, and I think it's going to cause a lot of concern amongst a lot of people.
And we'll pivot over to Europe now. A little bit of a different landscape this week than it was a week ago or even 2 weeks ago. Jamie essentially has claimed all of Italy. I asked Switzerland if he'd be interested in attacking Italy for any of this very valuable land, and he said, nope, Spain asked me not to, and I'm going to respect that. So Spain is only going to continue to grow from a development perspective. They've also claimed Egypt for themselves. Netherlands exists today. Lotharingia essentially does not. England has made a small inroad into mainland Europe. If you're in the heart of this area, every player war in the first few sessions seemed to be here. This past week, we had nothing. what will this coming week bring us?
Well, uh, I'm not sure. The biggest thing is that now that Lothringia's gone, how do I put this nicely? Frankly, Lothringia felt for a lot of players kind of like it was just there and sort of in the way, in the sense that because it went Lothringia, it couldn't be the Netherlands and couldn't be the bank of the mainland Europe, and thus there are other countries that could maybe use that land more effectively than Lothringia could. In particular, Westphalia, who could become the Netherlands, as we saw, or Prussia, who could just use the land to make it into a manpower factory, which they tend to be doing. Um, I wanted my French stuff, and I have since the start, but that's a whole other issue. So now that that's gone, I'm not as sure where the future is going to be going for Europe. With the withdrawal, basically, of the Italy player, Spain is basically going to secure all of Italy, which is basically his price for having to have fought so hard to take parts of Italy in the first place. And no one really, at this point, really wants to challenge him on that. From what I understand, there is no intention of going any further north in Italy. He just basically wants this Mediterranean stuff, which makes sense. It allows him to secure the Venetian as well as the Genoese nodes, and since he's securing Egypt, that allows him to funnel trade coming in from the Red Sea and India and siphon off of that to push that into either of those two nodes, which makes him a lot of money. Plus, some of his New World stuff can feed in there. He's most definitely looks like he's trying to concentrate trade around the Italian peninsula rather than let it flow elsewhere. That's generally why I'm fairly sure he'll be pretty content once he has Italy locked down. Well, in Europe, I should say. In North Africa, different story. But I'm not. Spain should be fairly quiet in the European front for now. With Lothringia gone, I think most of Europe's going to be somewhat stable, depending on how satisfied people are with the current borders. I don't know if there might be some changes coming.
So you're telling me there's no wars on the horizon in Europe?
There's lots of potential wars I could see. Prussia could want to take Westphalia stuff for German stuff. He could want to go after Switzerland for German stuff because he might want to push the Form Germany button. Commonwealth could want to go after Prussia to preempt a threat. Austria probably is going to have to be eaten up. Palatinate, a vassal, Prussia will probably be eaten, but maybe the Netherlands wants that land as well. Spain might throw troops in to get involved. These are all hypothetical scenarios. Oh, and Sweden probably still has a grudge to pick against Prussia, and also Swedish quality troops and Prussian quality troops are like a classic rivalry. Britain might want to lock down more of the Channel trade and might go after the Netherlands. There's all sorts of hypotheticals. Nothing I see immediately. I think after all of the wars in Europe, people are sort of willing to maybe let it give a session for pause and rest, but I don't know for sure.
And Zale, what's your take on the current political situation in Europe? Is it peace in our times, or did they just take a session to recover, rearm, and gear up?
Do you mind clicking on France with the Diplo real quick before I give you my answer? Yeah, that's what I thought. You know, if you're talking a lot about all these other nations going to war, the Palatinate borders you. Palatinate's a Prussian vassal. The Brits border you as well, and your only ally is Portugal. You can't fight a land war. Right? He can do a good job at the sea, but right now, you can't fight a land war. And so I think with, Sweden allied to Russia, Prussia allied to the Ottomans, Sweden also allied to Great Britain. I believe Prussia is transferring trade to someone. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, there is no outbound transfer by Prussia.
Okay.
The Commonwealth are transferring to Sweden.
Yeah. So what I think is the kind of the central powers are not going to be wanting to fight the Asian powers right away. I don't think you guys are especially eager for that. And they have a much more isolated, maybe not weaker, but isolated target in France who doesn't have a huge amount of allies. Maybe Spain will ally them. That's what I would highly recommend if you're trying to. I would recommend you try to get an alliance with Spain or something. But it seems that there's a lot of people who could use just a little bit more dev here or there, just a small amount more. And it seems kind of that Fuhrer is the easiest way for them to get that, or the Netherlands. So I think that this upcoming session, one of those two are going to have to go. And I could be wrong, but just the way it is, I think in order to effectively gain an edge against their overseas or different continental rivals, people are going to be looking for the easy ways to just gain that little bit of extra so they can get that edge.
Yeah, I think you're both wrong. I think England has exposed themselves a little bit too much with their incursion onto mainland Europe. They have 3 forts here, which generate a decent amount of war score, 12%, 16. So the English only have a Swedish ally on the mainland. If the Netherlands or Prussia attacks England, I don't see England being able to hold on to this land. If they had just Calais, they could last forever. Maybe Calais and Bremen, but there's so much money in this node. Being able to snag these 2 COTs away from England, I just can't see these 3 allowing that to happen.
That's a good point, but Great Britain has only one alliance right now, and I think that they're open to changing alliances and getting a lot larger. So it definitely Great Britain has exposed themselves. I'm not sure. It depends on their Diplo. If they get a good Diplo ally, then I think that they're going to be in a good position. But they got their fingers in. It is true, they got their fingers in a lot of different pies right now. A lot of different ways people can come after them. So.
And they're
Yeah.
just from a Diplo perspective, unfortunately, they are not able to ally Spain, which would secure their European mainland holdings. So Great Britain would have to look towards, oh God, I don't even know who would have. Sweden, obviously, nothing to ignore, 500,000 manpower, decent force limit, but Prussia right up there, almost 500,000, 300 force limit. For the right number of ducats, the Ottomans may participate in that war, 1,000,000 manpower and 500,000 force limit. So, yeah, I think England needs help, or else they're bound to lose some of this land. What's your take on that, Fear?
It's certainly possible. The other thing we got to consider is that there are powers that are viewed as effectively as existential threats. A Prussia that has 500,000 manpower and about a 300,000 troop force limit with Prussian quality is a terrifying prospect for a lot of people. A Russia with infinite vast supplies of manpower and qualitatively no slacker either is also a terrifying prospect. And Ottomans, granted, Ottoman troop quality starts to fall off now, so maybe a little less so than it used to be. But still, with 1.3 million manpower is a daunting prospect as well. Spain sort of also starts to fall off now qualitatively because they no longer have their age bonus and their military modifiers are decent but not the best.
Oh, actually,
starting
I'd
to fall
say
as well, but still, yeah, they're still quite scary for sure, quite strong.
artillery fire.
15% is nothing to sneeze at. It's more usually when compared with Spain or France that people go at not quite as good, but that's still quite strong.
Yeah, outside the French Elan,
Yeah.
this bonus actually becomes more and more important as the game wears
Yes,
on.
especially as the game goes on. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. One more fire pip's huge. Definitely, it's a big buff. So they're still pretty strong. At this point, a lot of parties, including those players, will be looking at the other large countries and be like, and start to really consider, I might have to do something about this. This might be too big a threat. This is too much of a threat to me or to my neighbors who I don't want to harm or whatever. There might have to be a bit of a reckoning between those big powers. And that could be the focal point around which the less big powers will gravitate. Because if as much as people like, weak powers, killing off weak powers doesn't mean much while you let the already strong powers continue to get stronger. And so I think there's a point where you have to then shift to cutting down to size the larger powers rather than focusing on the weaker parties. So it's hard to say. There's all sorts of options and ways this could go.
And we'll pivot now and wrap up with a slightly different question than usual, just due to the state of the game. Zale, you know it's coming. If we look up on Saturday and there's a blue flame next to Nepal, who has declared an offensive war against Nepal?
Ain't nobody going to be declaring offensive war against me, I think. Potentially, if I had to guess, potentially Malaya.
Malaya,
I don't
not
see-
Russia.
Nah. I don't see, not with a Prussian-Ottoman alliance on their borders.
Okay.
It's not happening. No, not while they're still allied with the Commonwealth.
And Fuhr, blue flame next to France. Who's attacking you?
Who's attacking me? Oh,
It's a hypothetical.
hypothetical. I mean, frankly, probably Prussia, since Spain doesn't seem to really care about France. So that would probably be my guess. Yeah, if someone is attacking France and I'm a defender, yeah, that would probably be Prussia.
And from an Ottoman perspective, I'm going to go Russia. One of the few things I did to Russia when they unconditionally surrendered, I secured Astrakhan for Georgia. It's not a center of trade or anything, but it is an estuary in a relatively small trade node. There's only one center of trade in the entire place, and we've been able to siphon off a decent amount of income from the Russians. So I'm expecting blue flames directed at Georgia and their faithful Ottoman ally answering the call. Any closing thoughts?
It's gonna be, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Zil.
It's going to be interesting for me to see who has the highest, or where the highest ship kills are going to be. Because right now it's off the coast of South Africa, just to the west, which you have to see in Skanderbeg. I think there's been 88 ships lost there. The second highest is 70-ish off the coast of China. And as things start to take a more of a colonial view and stuff, and as you point out, Britain is sort of expanding overextending themselves a little bit. It'll be interesting to see where these naval battles are going to start taking place, and if they're going to be taking place far away from these European homelands, perhaps it'll be time for other people to try to cheeky thing or not. I don't know. That's just going to be interesting to me to see.
Definitely. I was just going to say that this upcoming session is going to be pretty interesting. I mean, they all are. They always are. But I think this one, in a lot of ways, there are a lot of knowns, but perhaps just as many unknowns in this particular case. Like in previous cases, you could say there's all sorts of really big and eventually going to have to come to conflict points, like France and Burgundy, Ottomans, Mamluks, that kind of stuff. Now, as a lot of those have gone away, alliances seem to be more fluid, allegiances and ambitions seem to be changing and shifting. It's going to be interesting to see, while we still do have some of those core major friction points, like Ottomans and Russia, Commonwealth and Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Rajput Ottomans, Qing and Malaya, all that stuff. So it's going to be an interesting game, and as things go forward, I think we're going to get more uncertainty in terms of the shifting diplomatic and friction points in the game.
Yeah, should be a good one, and I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, folks. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
My pleasure.